we will continue with Ecclesiastes this morning. We got into it a little bit. We kind of talked about kind of the four big questions. We talked about the issues of origin, purpose, and destiny. And we're talking here about the meaning of life, not, the word meaningless is a little bit confusing because that might mean like incoherent or like unintelligible. Like if I was up here just speaking gibberish, that would be meaningless. But what we're really getting at is this word vanity, as it's sometimes translated, I think we've talked about better being kind of understood as pointless or futile. But also, what we want to get at is it's not that nothing matters so much. It's that sometimes life is enigmatic. Okay? Do you guys know what an enigma is or enigmatic? Yeah.
Isn't it like purpose?
Well, kind of. What's that?
Purposeless.
Well, purposeless would be a good word to have up here as well. But yeah, so it's like, what is the point? What is the purpose? That's good. But what is an enigma? As you may remember, if you like SpongeBob, Patrick has his secret box that SpongeBob wants to see inside. And he says, "The inner workings of my mind are an enigma." And then he sees in his mind the milk falling over on the table. What's enigmatic? An enigma. He talks about this also a little bit at the beginning of Proverbs. Proverbs help you understand and solve what? I'll reference another cartoon. The Scooby-Doo, what are they always trying to solve?
A mystery?
Mysteries, yeah. Mysterious. Things that are riddle, things that are confusing or defy easy explanation. They don't make a lot of sense. And so there are things like that in the world, like there are Proverbs. This is how life ought to work. And these are the results that often are probably from wisdom. But Ecclesiastes and Job say, well, wait a second. A lot of times life doesn't work like this. And we have these confusing things that happen in life that just make it seem, what is the point of this? What is the purpose of that? It seems futile when you look at it just by itself. Right? And so we'll look at that today. Patrick, Abigail, you had your hands up for Enigma. Did you want to add something? Or
I was just going to say it's mysterious.
Mysterious? Okay, that's good. Abigail, were you good? Okay. Yeah, so it's basically something that's the beginning of Proverbs talks about to understand a riddle or the complicated saying, right? To kind of get at something. And that's why it calls it vanity or striving after the wind. It's like you can kind of feel it, see it, but you can't really get a hold of it. That's what the issue is here with Ecclesiastes. And it's going to say, if you look at life and how we live and what goes on under the sun and human experience, it seems, if you look at it too hard, to be pointless. Right? And it seems to be vanity, chasing smoke, chasing the wind. Right? And so he's not saying that life doesn't matter, ultimately, but he's saying there's aspects of human life and experience that just, apart from God, show themselves to be pointless and futile. Okay, so we talked about this last time, that life kind of moves on. There's this purposeless monotony. A generation comes, a generation goes, the sun rises, and going to its place, it sets again. But there's just kind of this course that goes on. People don't often think that much about life or kind of the deeper questions. And even if they do, they may get the answers wrong or not think about the things correctly. And so Solomon says, look, he says, I'm looking at everything that's done under the sun, he prays 1:14, and it all seems to be vanity and striving after the wind. Because life is not making sense, according to Solomon. He says, let me show you some examples. Okay? And we talked last time about remembrance. We talked about, most of the things we do are not going to be remembered. And we're not really going to be remembered most likely either. They're somewhat, maybe. But even if we are remembered, it doesn't mean we're going to be remembered or thought about in the way that we would think. We think our lives are super significant, but in the larger scheme of things, you and I won't meet most people on the planet We won't know their lives, we won't know their deaths, we won't know their legacy, what they went through, anything like that, and they won't know us either, right? Even people in our family, our great-grandchildren will probably not know our names. They could look us up maybe, but they can't know us, right? And so it says, okay, then what is, how does life work? Right? And so we looked at, human activity and wisdom, that Solomon says, even look, everything that people do just seems to be pointless. You can't, what's crooked, you can't straighten out. What's lacking can't be counted. Meaning you can't fix everything. And so now Solomon says, well, let me try instead to pursue wisdom, which we know wisdom is good, and Solomon talks about that in Ecclesiastes. Talks about it everywhere. That the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom is better than foolishness. It will say this. I'll read this later. It says, like light is better than darkness. For seeing around, wisdom is better. He goes, but there's still a mystery around wisdom, because it doesn't always benefit you in the way that you think it does. In fact, we're going to read now how wisdom is actually a burden to bear in some ways. Wisdom comes with a cost. So I don't know if I told you that when we started studying biblical wisdom, and I said, yeah, we need to acquire wisdom. What I didn't warn you about is that wisdom comes with a cost. It comes with sort of a burden that's not that fun to bear. Okay, so let me show you what this burden of wisdom is, and you guys already know this. I'll show you. We'll formalize it. We'll see what it says here. But you guys, I guarantee, already are aware that knowing more is not always helpful or fun, or it doesn't always give you some greater benefit. Right? So it's like sometimes the more you know, the more frustrated you are. Right? That's the cost of wisdom. That's the burden of wisdom. Listen to Solomon in 1:16. He says, I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased in wisdom, more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. That's great. 17, I set my mind to know wisdom and know madness and folly. So I examined very carefully wisdom and foolishness. And then he says, and I realized that this also is striving after the wind. You go after wisdom, even if you get it, wisdom comes with this burden. Can somebody read Ecclesiastes 1:18? Ecclesiastes 1:18. Yeah, Abigail.
For much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow.
Okay, so that's a good word for it. Vexation. Have you guys heard that term before? Pride and Prejudice. Have you guys read this book, or seen the 6-hour movie? Okay, you got to watch, if you like Pride and Prejudice, there's a better version, but it's longer. It's with Colin Firth, and it's not the Keira Knightley one that's like 2 hours. There's a 6-hour, it's like has 6-hour 1-hour episodes. But the mom in Pride and Prejudice, and it follows the book very closely, she's like all kind of crazy, and she's like, oh, it vexes me greatly, this and that. We don't use that term vexation much, but that's kind of like an internal frustration at the way things are, but you can't do anything to make it right. It's a great word. I had heard that in wisdom there's much grief. Why does he, and in knowledge there's increasing pain? Yeah.
Can I start?
Yeah, that's fine. Why does he say in much... so what's the burden of wisdom? The more you know... What?
The more you realize his sin.
The more you realize sin? Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, Macy.
The more you're accountable for.
Okay, that's true too. Yeah. But also, think external. The more you know about things, you look at the world around you and you get frustrated. Why?
Increasing in sorrow.
Increasing in sorrow. You realize things aren't right. And even if you know the right answer, people don't often know it themselves, or even if they do know it, they don't follow it, or they don't want to hear it, or whatever the case may be. I follow on Facebook a page where it's for memes and stuff, but it's memes that these are just screenshots that people get. And the Facebook page is called People Incorrectly Correcting Other People. Okay, you guys get what this page is about. It's about people who are wrong, who think they're right, who comment to tell someone who is right that they are wrong. Okay? And so it's like somebody saying something dumb, thinking they're really smart, and like thinking that they're setting a person straight. Right? That's the feeling Solomon is getting at here, is that there's this, the more you know, there's a frustration that comes from seeing the world with wisdom, where, you know, in some ways it helps not to know. And even if you know about like events and stuff, you're more informed, but you and I aren't able to do anything about it. In fact, I think there's a great cost, and some people should get rid of this altogether, but there's a great cost that comes from watching the news and watching social media, that people think because they know more that they're more effective, but it actually makes people feel very powerless, because you can't do anything about it. You could send some money, you can pray, those are great things that would be constructive. But the thing is, there are problems all over the world, and you and I can't do much about them. So social media, I think, has given us this impression that we know so much more, but also this kind of feeling of, now I feel bad, I can't do anything about it. But I know about it, right? So, and you have people trying to solve the world's problems on social media, right? And you see how well that goes, right? Or I guarantee you could talk to somebody, I'm not saying in a disrespectful way, but you could listen to somebody on Sunday morning at church, and no matter how great the sermon was, filled with hope and biblical truth, that person is still going to spout out, all the things they watch the news constantly, and that's the thing that's on their heart and mind. Or younger people get into YouTube rabbit hole, and they spend months looking at this one, area of something. They come out and they're like, okay, all they talk about now is, this or that thing. And you're like, okay, but knowing more of that has no effect on your life. It has no impact on you, So there is an aspect of knowing more that's a huge waste of time. Sometimes people know more of the wrong things. So, and even if you know the right things, like a lot of times it doesn't help. Sometimes I'm like, yeah, I wish I'd, and I'm not trying to say this in a prideful way, but I wish I didn't know some of the things I know, so that when people say them, I don't feel the need to be like, okay, now I have to, do I keep my mouth shut, or do I say something, or what? So even in wisdom, it's like, okay, the wisdom comes with a cost, according to Ecclesiastes. So, now Solomon pivots in chapter 2 and says, well, let's try out pleasure. And this includes sinful pleasure, okay? But it's not, not all sinful pleasure, right? So, if we just put up here pleasure, right? We can do kind of a Venn diagram of pleasure and non-sinful pleasure, right? So there's not necessarily sometimes pleasure overlaps with sin, but in a lot of ways it doesn't, right? So there's sinful pleasure that's here in the middle, right? But there's also pleasure that's good, right? That you enjoy things, that you have fun, that you laugh with friends and family. You maybe work out, maybe you get some exercise, maybe you do something you enjoy, you eat something, you have a good meal, whatever the case may be, you do something productive that you like. That's all good. Then there's sinful pleasure, right? There's sex, there's drunkenness, there's pornography, there's being selfish, there's greediness, there's gluttony, which is not gluttony, by the way, is not overeating. Gluttony is being like sinfully lacking self-control in a way that shows disregard for others. It's associated with something like drunkenness, not having a big meal, on Thanksgiving. And so Solomon now says, okay, let's pivot and try out pleasure. Okay, 2:1. Let's look at this one here. he said, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. Okay, so it says now, Solomon says, I'm going to push myself to the limits of saying it's too much of a pain in the neck to learn about all this stuff, and then when I learn about it, it frustrates me. Okay, much knowledge, there's much grief. So I'm going to focus my life on pleasure. Why work so hard? Why get so worked up? That's kind of true, right? Why take life so seriously? That is also true, in a sense. Okay, so but then he says in 2:1, and behold, it too was futility. This is a kind of scary point that I think we can use and leverage, especially for people your age to my age, and for people who need to hear the gospel, who say, well, God just wants to constrain me, tell me what to do. I'm not under any type of authority. I'm just going to make my life about pleasure. But what we need to be able to show them, I think biblically, is that pleasure doesn't have a point and purpose, and it comes to an end. And ultimately, the real scary thing is it doesn't ultimately satisfy you. So you think that you're going to derive ultimate satisfaction from pleasure, and you can try really hard to get there, but you won't be able to achieve it. And that's where people get to often a breaking point where they're like, wait a second, my whole life is about pleasure. I can't even really enjoy it, right? Because I realize my pleasure is all pointless. And so that's where, a lot of people have to get to. Listen to 2:2. He says, I said of laughter, it is madness. And of pleasure, what does it accomplish? He said, I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine. Okay, so drunkenness. While my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good is there for the sons of men to do the few years of their lives. Right? He has a point. We only live for a certain amount of years. Right? You might as well have some fun. There are not, people who live their whole lives and never laugh, never have fun. Like what? That's pointless too. And so he's saying here, though, the people who try to orient their lives around pleasure ultimately get to the point where pleasure doesn't mean anything. And then they're totally lost. Okay? So this was so Solomon said basically, and I've tested out my mind and my body with wine. So he says this is just one example, alcohol. And he says, look, all I got was a hangover. You and I could go to any college campus today. I don't even care if it's a Christian campus where you're not supposed to drink. There are people there who are getting drunk all the time too. Whether they signed a contract or not. And the truth is, you've seen people who, over the 3-day weekend, spent the 3-day weekend on a binge trying to pursue pleasure, often through drunkenness. And all it gets them at the end is, man, I feel just bad the next day. Right? That pleasure came to an end, and what did it get them? Well, it was a little bit of fun, and then nothing, consequences, right? So, and I've seen this. You guys may not have seen, hopefully you haven't seen in some ways, real drunkenness. Not here, but before I worked here, I would go to parties and stuff with teachers, so it was supposed to be like a monthly get together, and it was fun. But then the people would really let loose and start drinking, and teachers drink a lot. Hopefully not, your teachers. I don't think that's true, but the teachers, when they really let loose, they get very drunk. And I don't personally drink, and so but they're like, how do you survive without alcohol? And I'm like, so what their mindset there was that, and I was like, well, I like, Diet Coke, what? But their mindset there was that they're kind of living for the weekend to drink and stuff like that. And I'm not trying to judge them in an unfair way. These are people that I liked and were friends and stuff, and we had some good conversations and good relationships. But I was like, this is kind of just sad or gross. Like, what's the point? I saw this also when I was in college. I was in the Model United Nations. We'd go, and you think like these people were all wearing like suits and nice dresses and things, and we're doing this Model United Nations thing. Everyone's smart, and everybody's getting advanced degrees and all this stuff, and they study politics for fun, and all this stuff. And then came time at the end, where people are going out at night, getting crazy drunk. Knew people who wouldn't eat during the day so that they would get drunk faster at night, right? And the next morning, writing down people, just the change in the elevator. People were having a headache from this hangover. They're like, oh gosh, and I'm there just like, just like, and I'm not saying, by the way, by way of contrast, I'm just saying, like, what did that ultimately get them, right? Now, they would look at me and they'd say, okay, well, Mortar didn't have any fun. Well, I did, but, my fun is hopefully oriented by the Lord. I can have fun because I know I'm right with God, okay? But other people, it's like you get drunk, that's what he's saying here. It's like you can use pleasure. Pleasure is good. It can be from God, but it can't be understood or enjoyed properly if you use it just for itself. It loses its purpose. Okay? And so that's what he gets at. And so he says, okay, Solomon talks about drunkenness, he talks about sexual pleasure, but he also talks about building and growing and accomplishments here. So he says, look, I also expanded, I built stuff. I tried to make cool things, and some of what Solomon did last, and he built great wealth and all these sorts of things. But he says there was, meaninglessness in that as well, right? That there was still an ultimate purposelessness that didn't satisfy. Now he says, here's the problem that I realized the limits of, let's talk about labor, okay, before we talk about... let's talk about the limits of wisdom here. Okay, so here's what Solomon's going to point out again. Okay, 2:12. Okay, so you guys can probably infer where he's going with this. You have the wise man and the fool. In a sense, it doesn't matter because they're both going to what? Die. Yeah. So he says, wisdom's better qualitatively, but he says, but both of them can die. And they're both facing death. That's a reality for both of them. So he says, look, if you just focus on wisdom for the sake of wisdom, or on foolishness for the sake of foolishness, it's pointless because both of them have to ultimately face death. So if you don't orient life around the reality of death, then you're missing a big part of the point. Right? So what is our ultimate destiny? What happens when we die? What takes place? I have a cousin who's not a believer, and I love him, but he posts this thing on social media every once in a while where he says, life is, don't take life so seriously. No one gets out alive anyway. And he has a point in the fact that we shouldn't take ourselves so seriously. But his point that I believe is missed from a biblical standpoint is that because we don't get out alive is why we should take life seriously, because we all have to die and face God in judgment. So it's there is the biblical sense of, you guys know YOLO? Did they ever say that in your generation? That was popular on my time. I always said it's a joke. YOLO, you only live once. It's true you only live once. But there's I'm not going to care. I'm just going to live for myself. And then there's you only live once, so get it right. Live life right. But Ecclesiastes says it's very hard to know, what that all means. Well, listen to this. 2:12. So I turn to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? Basically, you're just going to continue doing what humans do. And he said, I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. And then he says, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness, and yet I know that one fate befalls them both. So he says, look, wisdom is better. That's biblically correct. It's like light versus darkness. He says the wise person, their eyes are in their head. It's like, okay, they actually see, they actually get it. But he says here, though, one fate befalls them both. And that's death. That both the wise man and the fool die alike. Now, there is truth in the probability of, something like Proverbs, that if you live wisely, righteously, that, on average, you tend to live longer and happier. Okay? But the world is not that simple. Often, as we know, there are wise and righteous people who die young. There are godless people who seem to prosper and live a long time. Right? There are psalms that deal with that. Like, God, why is that the case? The Psalm 73 asks that question. Why do why do the wicked seem to do well? And they seem to not be hungry. They seem to be pretty fat and happy. What's the deal with that? And so Ecclesiastes says this. I'll give you an example. Another cousin of mine was talking to a friend of a friend. This guy was not friends with my cousin because my cousin was not going to be friends with a guy like this. But this guy basically said a very foolish thing. He was probably like 20, and I assume he's still alive. But this guy basically said that he was good at drunk driving. He says, I'm an effective drunk driver. Yeah, and he said to my cousin goes, dude, that's really messed up to try to get on the road when you are drunk. And the guy goes, practice makes perfect.
Statistically.
That's not something you practice, right? You can't do that. Well, you can, but here's the thing. So my cousin told that guy, he's like, that's really stupid. He goes, that's immoral. You could hurt and kill somebody else. You could, not only yourself, but you could kill yourself. You could damage property. You could paralyze someone. Practice makes perfect, right? Here's the thing. That guy may be driving on the road. There may be a guy who's wise driving on the road. The fool may kill the wise guy in a car accident, right? So the wise and the fool die alike. That's where life gets enigmatic, where you're like, well, that seems pointless. The wise person, is doing everything right, and he gets the consequences. Why does that happen in this world? Yeah.
What if that guy was so wise that he was able to drive drunk? Because he was just that wise.
Yeah, that's what Solomon said. While I was testing my mind with alcohol, my mind was wisely driving. But that's just like an example, right? There's one fate for the wise and the foolish, that whether you're one or the other, we both have to die and meet God in judgment, right? So our lives are oriented, even though we don't think about it a lot, our lives are oriented around death. That's a reality, that's a question we have to answer. Or basically, rather, a question that keeps coming up in human experience. Origin, where did I come from? Purpose, why am I here? Destiny, what happens when I die? Right? So if you and I don't have those answered, or don't have those answered correctly, then we don't know why we're living and what we're for and where we're going. And so your life is all over the place in this very sinful and complex and confusing world that Ecclesiastes describes. And he says, that's it. That's futility. That's pointlessness. And then listen to what Solomon says here. He says, this is the frustrating thing. It's like often the really good people die. They don't get remembered. In 2:16 he says, for there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool. Inasmuch as the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool die alike. Now listen, Solomon sounds kind of moody here, where he says, so I hated life. I just hate life. There are times where you hate life, right? And so he says, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after the wind. He goes, it just doesn't seem right that this is the reality of human experience in the world. He's not complaining against God. He's just saying, I hate this aspect of life where even if you're doing right, you can end up dying, just like a foolish person. Let's talk about labor. Let's talk about the work that we do. Work is important. Hard work is important. but there are limits to our labor. There's a good place for our work and our labor. But can someone read 2:18? This kind of sums up this section. Yeah, Bryn?
Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor, for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me.
Okay, so he says, look, I built up all this really great stuff and I worked really hard, but I kind of started to hate it because I realized, what? I leave my labor to who?
The next person.
The next person who comes after me. And once I'm dead and gone, I leave my whole life's work to that person, and you have no what?
Point or purpose.
Well, yeah, but after we die, basically, we give our stuff to the next generation, and then we cease to have what over our labor?
Control.
Control, or credit, yeah. We basically, yeah, sometimes we get the credit, but it doesn't really matter once we're gone, but also we'd have no control, right? You may build up, you may do really great with your finances, you may invent something that's life-changing for the world, you may do something that's really good, but in a sense, we pass it on to the next generation. They may not care about it the way that we do. They may not see the significance of it. They may forget about it, or they may manage it in a way that we don't like. Right? So that's one of the things where it's like Proverbs talks about that the righteous man leaves an inheritance to children's children. Okay, so that's good. But then Ecclesiastes says, but your kids and grandkids may do stupid things with your inheritance. And that often happens. There were amazing entrepreneurs and businessmen in the 1800s who started things like steamboats and railroads and steel and oil and all these things, and created very effective products and all sorts of things. That stuff that impacts the world as we even use it today. And yet, a lot of them passed their companies onto their kids, and their kids just kind of ran the company. Some of them ran it okay, and then some of them ran it into the ground. Right, so you can't control it, right? And then at the end, your stuff and my stuff does not come with us. We don't get to control our resources once we're gone. And you know what the sad thing is like the inheritance is a lot of people decide, even if they're very wealthy, they decide not to leave an inheritance to their children because a lot of people have noticed when you do leave a big inheritance to your kids that they didn't work for, they don't treat the money in the same way. They often blow it and mishandle it because it's not, they didn't work for it, so they don't view it the same way. Right? So Solomon's like, man, it kind of sucks that I worked so hard only to give up all this to the next generation where I have no control. Listen to 2:19, he says, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, meaning who you pass your stuff on to. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor, for which I have labored, acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. He goes, I work very hard to pass on, my legacy to someone else, and then I have no control. Right? So that's a difficult one. Here's another aspect of labor that's kind of something to think about. If we're both still here together, and when you guys are in 12th grade and you take economics, which I also teach, we'll talk about theories of value. And this is one that people often get tripped up on. But basically, your labor does not have value and significance unless others agree with you. Right? So I could work for years building a factory on this one project, hiring people, paying for the factory. 10 years later, I produce my giant, my one big giant tricycle. And I say, okay, I'm going to sell this to people. Let's start the bidding at $100,000. And people say, I don't want a giant tricycle. And I'm like, but I worked really hard on it. It cost me a lot to make it. You can say, and I don't care. You can't make somebody, value your labor. Right? So that's an aspect of labor too, that our labor doesn't necessarily mean all that we think it does. Think about it like this too. I'm not saying our work is unimportant, but you guys did assignments last week, last month, and this class, math class, science, other stuff. it's over and done with. That labor is gone. Hopefully you learned something along the way, but it's kind of like the assignment's gone. It's done, right? The work that we did for Hollywood Impact Studios last week, it's good. We were serving those people, serving the Lord. We can kind of view that from a wider perspective. But if you just look at the work itself, just in and of itself, we did work that is going to have to be done again. It's not going to last, right? We cleared a driveway, we cleared some leaves, we dug a ditch, we did all this stuff. It's not going to last, right? It will have to be done again. Okay? So the Lord can give significance to your labor, where it says, okay, everything we do for God. We do it, we're serving Christ, not ourselves. So when we turn in, sloppy work, it's actually turning in sloppy work to the Lord or doing something that's not honoring to Christ. So that makes everything that we do matter. But if you take it out of that context, what's the point of our work? Right? We do all this work day and night, and we can't rest, we can't sleep, it's on our minds, and he says this is all pointless. But here is where he gets to a good point here in Ecclesiastes, where he says, 2:24. Can somebody read Ecclesiastes 2:24? Yeah, Patrick.
I'll borrow your turn. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God.
Okay. So he says, look, there is a purpose for labor, but you can't understand labor and enjoy it or see any benefit from it unless you see it from the hand of God and enjoy it in that context. So it's like we can either have one or two ways of viewing our work. Otherwise, if we view it without God, it's all pointless, it's not going to last, and it doesn't ultimately matter. And we can't control it after we're gone. The other way is God has given us a work to do. He's called us, He's given us purpose. God will decide what lasts. We just need to be faithful to do our work and enjoy the fruits of our labor while we live on this earth. But listen to 2:25. I want you guys to pick up on this key verse here. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? Okay, I'm going to actually write that on the board here. Okay, so he says here, because this is where we get a good conclusion. He says, for who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him. Okay, this is 25? Yeah, 2:25. That you and I are actually, if we don't live relative to God, defining our purpose, our origin, our destiny, then we actually are inhibiting our own pleasure and enjoyment. You and I are getting in our own way of enjoying things the way we're supposed to and enjoying them fully if we don't know God. So a lot of times people think that becoming a Christian, following Christ, yes, we count the cost, right? There's suffering, there's things that happen, there's sin, there is potentially, persecution, whatever the case may be. But what we're really showing people is you think you're finding pleasure in all these things, and you may be, but that pleasure is pointless. What you really need to know is the full pleasure in things that comes from knowing God. It's only when you know God that you find pleasure in the things that He created and what He's given us to do. So for example, when you and I eat, okay, Ecclesiastes says we don't understand and enjoy our food fully until we understand its connection with that God has given it to us, right? And what it's for, right? So the Bible is actually not anti-pleasure, it's pro-pleasure. It is saying that God is the source of where we find our meaning, our purpose, our pleasure, and enjoyment in. Who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? Lots of people, unbelievers, would say, yeah, I enjoy the world a lot better without God in it to tell me what to do. What we're trying to show here is that the pleasure is not lasting and ultimately isn't real and isn't significant without knowing God. And so that's what Solomon gets to. But listen to 2:26. This one's a comforting verse if you're a believer, but it's a scary verse if you're an unbeliever. Okay, listen to 2:26. It says, to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. Okay, and now he says, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to the one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. So God says, hey, look, believers, their work may not, every aspect of it may not last, but they can enjoy it from the hand of God. And they can recognize eternity. They can recognize who God is. They know their origin, purpose, and destiny. He goes, but for the unbeliever, this is what God has given them to do. This is the futility of their lives. They work and accomplish things so that God can ultimately transfer everything they've done to God's people. Okay? So the example I've used before is, you guys know Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, right? Okay? Thomas Edison, that is a invention, in essence, using it right now, right? So we're still benefiting from that. But Thomas Edison was not a believer. He did not know God. He was a well-known skeptic, and unless he repented at the end, which I don't see any evidence of, he wasn't a believer. So God used a guy like Thomas Edison to create a world-changing invention that we still use today, so that ultimately, Ecclesiastes says, to benefit God's people. It benefits other people as well, but he says, look, the unbeliever, everything that they do that lasts, that God makes last, is to ultimately benefit his people. Right? So if you're an unbeliever, that means all your work either isn't going to last or it's going to be transferred over to accrue to the benefit of others. For the believer, we eat, we drink, we enjoy in the context of knowing God, knowing what things are for. And so this is what he says. This is striving after the wind. This is vanity. This is an enigma, right? That God uses some very smart, very capable unbelievers to create things, create stuff for God's people to use. And that's what. And then they die. You didn't thank Thomas Edison this morning when you turned on your light. You didn't probably even think about him. And even if you did, it doesn't, he's already dead and gone, right? He already met God. He already stood before God in judgment. So his contribution is done. Right? So that's the wake-up call of Ecclesiastes. Okay, we've got to end that there.